March 6, 1944, 25,000 feet above Frankfurt. The sky was crystal clear, the type of clarity that pilots dream about. But on that day, in that airspace, clarity was the last thing the Luftwaffe wanted. Inside a Bf-109 cockpit, Oberleutnant Klaus Meissner adjusted his oxygen mask, eyes scanning the contrails stretching endlessly across the sky. He had flown more than 200 missions, Eastern Front, North Africa, defending the heart of Germany itself. But what he was witnessing now, it didn't make sense. The American bombers were coming. That was expected. Hundreds of B-17s in rigid formation, glinting in the afternoon sun. Meissner could count them like black beads strung across the horizon. He had seen them before, heard them, fought them. But what paralyzed his instincts wasn't their number. It was what flew beside them. The P-51s were still there. That should have been impossible. The Americans had a pattern. Every mission followed a rhythm. The fighters would enter German airspace, escort the bombers past the front lines, then peel off. Always. Their fuel range couldn't take them deeper. That's when the real fight began. That's when the Luftwaffe would rise from the airfields of Würzburg, Kassel, and Erfurt like a vengeful swarm to intercept and punish the now exposed bombers. It had been that way for months, but today, that rhythm was broken. The Mustangs weren't turning back. They were pressing forward, staying in formation, escorting the bombers not just to the edge of Germany, but into its very lungs. Klaus felt a weight in his stomach. Not fear, not yet, but the beginning of something his training never taught him to process. A quiet realization, a new presence above German skies, sleek, vast, relentless, and worst of all, still full of fuel. Back at the airfield briefing earlier that day, his commanding officer had laughed at the intelligence report. Rumors of new fuel tanks, American propaganda. Nothing could fly from England to Berlin and back with guns blazing. Not yet, but now, as a pair of Mustangs broke off formation and began a high-speed climb toward his position, Meissner's gloved hand hesitated over the throttle. He could see them clearly. Shimmering silver bodies, long noses, no drop tanks, no hesitation. They had come to fight, and they weren't in a hurry to leave. He banked hard left, diving to gain speed, the instinct of a veteran. But the P-51s responded instantly, moving like creatures born in thinner air. The radio crackled with warnings, multiple sightings. Flak crews were already tracking targets. Yet none of it mattered. Not really. Because, at that moment, something had fundamentally changed. The Luftwaffe had built its entire strategy on the assumption that the American fighters would eventually run out of breath, that they would fall away, leaving the bombers vulnerable, that Germany could strike once the enemy showed weakness. But the P-51 didn't show weakness. It brought the fight all the way to the doorstep of the Reich. Within minutes, the first wave of German interceptors was falling back in disarray. 1, 2, 5 kills. Clean, fast, brutal. Meissner managed to evade with a damaged wing and a broken radio, limping his way back to base as smoke pillars rose behind him. He didn't speak for hours. Not during debriefing. Not that evening. Not even when the mechanics asked about the damage. Because he knew what they didn't. He had seen it with his own eyes. The Americans had figured it out. For months, Luftwaffe command had reassured its pilots that the Reich was protected by depth, that the American escort problem was still unsolved, that, given enough losses, the Allies would be forced to scale back. That hope was dead now. Not wounded, not shaken, dead. What Meissner had witnessed that day was not a new plane. It was a new rule. A machine that could outclimb the Bf-109, outturn the Focke-Wulf 190 at high altitudes, and reach Berlin without blinking. Behind each Mustang, a factory. In Detroit had built another. Behind each pilot, a training school in Texas had trained 10 more. And beneath them, the German homeland was now within reach of a force that didn't need to retreat. That day, something deeper than a tactic died. The idea of sanctuary, the illusion of aerial control, the comfort of home skies. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe was on the defensive even before it left the ground, and the American pilots knew it. They flew differently, not tentative, not rushed, confident, cold, like wolves entering a forest they had already mapped. Those watching from the ground reported something strange. They said the P-51s didn't just fly past, they circled, they climbed, they waited, as if inviting the enemy to respond. And when they did, the sky exploded. Years later, survivors would say they never saw them coming. That 1 second the air was clear, and the next it was filled with the hammering of 50-caliber machine guns. That even when they fired first, the Mustangs fired last. By the end of the day, air bases that had once celebrated victories were silent. Hangars were filled with damaged aircraft. Pilots stood by chalkboards that now showed losses, not kills. And in command rooms across Germany, questions no one had prepared for began to surface. How many Mustangs could they build? How often would they come? Was this the end of Luftwaffe dominance? The answer, though still unspoken, hung in the air like the contrails over Frankfurt. If you felt the tension of that sky, if you can imagine what it was like to look up and realize the rules had changed forever, tell us in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe now to join us in uncovering the forgotten chapters of history's most decisive air war. Long before the Mustang arrived over Germany, the Luftwaffe had a method. It was cold, logical, and built on experience, a brutal calculation shaped by years of war, thousands of missions, and the confidence of a force that had once dominated the skies over Europe. By 1943, that method had become a doctrine, a rhythm, an invisible structure of control that allowed a shrinking German air force to survive and even strike back against an enemy with overwhelming numbers. It all centered around one fragile truth: the American fighters could not go the distance. That single limitation shaped everything. Allied bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator could reach deep into German territory, but their escorts could not. The P-38 Lightnings and P-47 Thunderbolts, though effective, had a critical flaw. Their range was too short. They could only accompany the bombers part of the way. Once they reached a certain depth into Germany, the fighters had to turn back. And when they did, the bombers were alone. This was the moment the Luftwaffe waited for. The strategy was simple. Let the American formations advance. Let them cross the coast, the Rhine, the first defensive belts. Then, once the fighters turned for home, unleash the interceptors. Dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s scrambled from hidden airfields across Bavaria, Hesse, and Saxony, racing to catch the bombers before they reached their targets. It was a window of vulnerability, perfectly predictable and brutally effective. They called it the escort gap, and in that gap, thousands of American airmen died. Some missions lost more than 10% of their bombers in a single day. Gunners fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. B-17s flew in tight formations, banking on overlapping fields of fire. But against seasoned German pilots attacking in coordinated waves, the defense often collapsed. Engines caught fire, wings were torn off, crews bailed out over enemy territory. If they were lucky, more often they vanished in the smoke. The Luftwaffe didn't need to destroy every bomber. They just had to destroy enough to shake morale, enough to delay production, enough to make Washington and London question the cost of daylight bombing. For a time, it worked. In October 1943, during what became known as Black Week, American bomber losses reached catastrophic levels. The infamous Schweinfurt raids saw more than 60 bombers shot down in a single day. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. The damage inflicted on the German ball-bearing industry was significant, but the cost was staggering. There were serious talks about suspending unescorted deep penetration raids entirely. That was the psychological edge the Luftwaffe counted on. Not just physical destruction, but doubt, strategic doubt, political doubt, the kind that could paralyze an offensive campaign before it truly began. And it wasn't just about killing planes. It was about killing time. Every delayed raid gave German industries more hours to repair, relocate, or hide. Every canceled sortie bought more days to rebuild. Time became Germany's most valuable asset, and every Mustang that failed to appear kept that clock ticking. But beneath that surface of confidence, cracks had already begun to form. Fuel was running low, pilot losses were increasing, training programs were rushed. Some new recruits entered combat with less than 20 hours in the air. The Luftwaffe still fought hard, but it no longer replaced its fallen heroes with equals. The average age of German pilots was dropping, their experience thinning, their morale eroding. Yet even as the Luftwaffe weakened, the doctrine held. It was all they had left. The strategy that turned a numerical disadvantage into a tactical opportunity. The blueprint that gave them one last chance to defend the skies above their cities. They relied on it like a blind man relies on a cane. Without it, they were exposed. And so, the myth endured, that Allied fighters could never make it to Berlin and back, that Germany still had time, still had space, still had an aerial buffer zone that even the best American technology could not cross. That assumption was more than a military belief. It was psychological armor for pilots, for commanders, even for civilians. The idea that there was still a line the enemy could not cross, that some sanctuary remained behind the front lines, a place where flak gunners could rest, where supply trains could move, where factories could operate under the illusion of distance. But distance was no longer a shield. It was about to become a trap. In late 1943, Allied reconnaissance had already picked up signs of change. New airfields under construction, new formations taking flight, the first sightings of P-51 Mustangs far deeper than ever expected. But the Luftwaffe dismissed the data. Just forward operating bases, they said. Just lucky tailwinds. Just more American tricks. They underestimated what was coming. The Mustang wasn't just a new plane, it was a complete disruption. A machine designed from the ground up to exploit the one thing the Luftwaffe depended on, the escort gap. Its range was longer, its fuel efficiency higher, its performance unmatched at altitude. For the first time, the United States had a fighter that could fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin, fight over the target, and return home. No more turning back, no more gaps, no more mercy. What made it worse for the Luftwaffe wasn't just the Mustang's capabilities, but the speed of its arrival. Within months, entire bomber groups were being re-equipped with long-range P-51 escorts. The industrial might of America had found its scalpel, and it was being delivered in waves. By the time the Mustang entered combat in force in early 1944, the German strategy was still rooted in 1943, and that delay, that refusal to adapt, would prove fatal, because war punishes not just weakness, but stubbornness. And while the Luftwaffe clung to a doctrine built on old limits, the skies above Germany were already shifting. The Mustang was in the air. The bombers were no longer alone. The game was about to change. If you find yourself drawn into the mechanics of strategy and the hidden turning points of war, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And for those who crave more stories buried beneath the surface of history, consider subscribing now. What comes next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about control of the skies. It began as a stopgap, an afterthought. In 1940, when the British approached the North American Aviation Company, they were not asking for a revolutionary fighter. They were simply looking for someone to produce the Curtiss P-40 under license, a basic, rugged aircraft that could hold the line. But North American had another idea. Instead of building someone else's design, they proposed something new, a faster, sleeker fighter built from scratch in just 120 days. The result was the NA-73, a prototype that would evolve into the P-51 Mustang. At first, no one thought much of it. The early models were powered by Allison V1710 engines, which performed well at low altitudes but choked in the thin air above 15,000 feet. It was fast, yes, and agile, but in high-altitude dogfights it was outclassed by the German Bf-109 and FW-190. The Royal Air Force relegated it to ground attack and reconnaissance. Useful, not game-changing. Then came the engine swap, and everything changed. Engineers at Rolls-Royce curious about the airframe's potential, began testing the Mustang with their Merlin 61 engine, the same power plant used in the legendary Spitfire Mach-9. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, the Mustang wasn't just fast at low level, it was fast everywhere. Climbing power increased, high-altitude performance soared, range extended. With the right fuel tanks, it could now escort bombers to Berlin and back. When news of this transformation reached the United States, the Packard Motor Company was tasked with building the Merlin under license. They did more than just replicate it. They improved the manufacturing process, making it faster and more consistent. The result was the Packard 5 1650, a two-stage supercharged engine capable of delivering over 1,400 horsepower at 30,000 feet. Combined with the Mustang's laminar flow wing, which reduced drag and improved efficiency, the aircraft became something entirely new. It was no longer a fighter. It was a predator designed for reach, for stamina, for domination at altitude, and it looked the part. The P-51 had the silhouette of a machine that meant business. Its long nose and sleek fuselage gave it a sense of speed even when parked on the tarmac. Its bubble canopy offered unparalleled visibility. Its .650 caliber Browning machine guns delivered devastating firepower. But its true weapon was none of those things. It was time. Time in the air. Time over target. Time to fight and still get home. With external drop tanks, the Mustang could fly over 1,600 miles without refueling. That distance rewrote the rules. For the first time, bomber crews looked out their windows and saw American fighters still with them deep into enemy territory. It was more than protection. It was psychological armor. Morale soared. Losses dropped. Entire missions returned without a single bomber lost. German pilots began to notice not just the shape of the new fighters, but their behavior. The Mustangs did not break off early. They did not avoid the fight. They hunted. They stalked. They climbed high and dove fast. Sometimes they didn't even wait for the bombers to be threatened. They flew ahead, sweeping the skies, clearing the path before a single bomb was dropped. For the Luftwaffe, this was a nightmare made real. Their previous tactics were built on exploiting gaps in coverage, but the Mustang erased the gap. There was no longer a safe zone, no predictable retreat, just a constant presence, relentless and calm. In combat, the Mustang's performance spoke for itself. It could outturn the FW-190 in a climbing spiral. It could outdive the Bf-109 in a vertical pursuit. It had the speed to run when needed, and the endurance to stay when necessary. Pilots described it as forgiving, stable, and lethal. It was fast enough to catch a fleeing jet on descent, and nimble enough to win a turn fight if handled correctly. But perhaps most remarkable was the industrial force behind it. America was not just building Mustangs, it was mass-producing them with ruthless efficiency. Factories in Inglewood and Dallas churned out thousands of airframes. Every bolt and rivet was standardized, every component interchangeable. This was not artisanal war. This was logistical supremacy turned into horsepower. For every Mustang lost, 3 more stood ready. For every pilot killed or captured, a dozen more were already in training. The United States had not only built a superior fighter, it had built a system to support it, a war machine behind the machine. Even the fuel system was revolutionary. The Mustang used a combination of internal and external tanks, including a fuselage tank, behind the pilot, carefully designed to balance weight and center of gravity. It wasn't perfect. Many pilots reported that the aircraft became unstable when the rear tank was full, so they adapted. They burned the fuselage tank first, then switched to the wings. It was a simple fix, one that gave them the edge without compromise. All of it added up to something rare in war, a turning point, not just of tactics or technology, but of fate. The P-51 Mustang was born in compromise and matured in desperation. But by 1944, it had become something much more, a symbol of reach, of resolve, of the moment when the war in the air stopped being defensive and became inevitable. Not because it was invincible, but because it was consistent, because it was always there. From takeoff to target, from coast to capital, and back again. If this kind of deep dive into the soul of a machine stirs your curiosity the way it stirred the skies of Europe, drop your thoughts in the comments below. And haven't yet joined us on this journey through the forgotten truths of air power, hit subscribe. There's more to discover, and every story brings us closer to understanding how machines like the Mustang didn't just fly, they changed the course of history. The morning of March 6, 1944, broke cold and silent over the English countryside. Along dozens of runways stretching from East Anglia to Yorkshire, ground crews moved like clockwork. They fueled engines, armed bombs, checked radios. In the early dawn haze, the silhouette of more than 800 B-17 flying fortresses stood motionless, waiting. This was not a routine mission. This was the first full-scale strike against Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich, the unshaken core of Nazi Germany's power. Until now, the Allies had touched the edges. They had bombed Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, but Berlin had remained a symbol, distant, protected, a target, yes, but never fully within reach. That illusion was about to shatter. What made this was not just the scale, it was the escort. Hundreds of P-51 Mustangs were lined up beside the bombers, engines idling low, the air already vibrating with a strange electricity. For the first time, the 8th Air Force would not send its bombers into the deep without cover. This time, the Mustangs were going all the way to Berlin, over Berlin, and back. At briefing, bomber crews were skeptical. They had heard promises before. They had watched their escorts peel off at the same invisible line for over a year. The idea of having fighter protection in the flak-filled skies above the German capital seemed like fantasy. But when wheels lifted and formations formed, the bombers looked out and saw something new. The Mustangs were still there. Through the English Channel, past the Rhine, over the German countryside, they stayed. And then, as the formation approached the target area, the sky came alive. Radar operators in Berlin had been tracking the wave for over an hour. Panic built behind the stone walls of command bunkers. Fighters were scrambled from every available airfield. Some pilots were dragged from breakfast tables. Others had just landed from overnight patrols. There was no time, no plan, just a desperate attempt to throw everything airborne into the path of the American offensive. The Luftwaffe had prepared for another battle like Schweinfurt. They expected the same pattern. Bombers alone, fighters gone. Just another opportunity to bleed the 8th Air Force dry. But what they saw above Berlin was something altogether new. The P-51s came in high, fast, coordinated. Before the German interceptors even reached the bomber boxes, the Mustangs were already diving into them. They did not wait. Captain Don Gentile, a Mustang pilot with the 336th Fighter Squadron, later described it as controlled chaos. His squadron broke through a formation of Focke-Wulf 190s climbing to engage. He lined up a shot, fired a burst, and watched the enemy fighter erupt in flame. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Mustang streaked past, chasing a second target. The sky was a blur of motion, tracers, and engine screams. What had once been a carefully timed dance of defense and attack was now a storm. The Luftwaffe, expecting predictability, was swallowed in disruption. German pilots reported something surreal. They couldn't tell where the Mustang formations ended. Every time they broke contact and tried to regroup, another wave came. High altitude, low angle, diving from above, climbing from below. The Mustangs moved like a net, tightening around them. In less than an hour, the Luftwaffe lost over 60 aircraft in air-to-air combat alone. By the end of the day, that number had nearly tripled. But the true damage wasn't just in losses. It was in psychology. One German ace, who survived the encounter, wrote later in his journal that for the first time, he felt hunted in his own sky. He had taken off expecting to engage helpless bombers. Instead, he was fighting for his life against an enemy that refused to break off. That chased him all the way down. That did not fear him. The P-51 pilots had trained for this. They knew their fuel limits. They knew the risks. And still, They pressed in. The mission was not just about protecting the bombers. It was about seizing air superiority, claiming the skies mile by mile above the Reich itself. At one point during the battle, Mustang pilot Major James Howard found himself alone against more than 30 German fighters while defending a formation of B-17s. He stayed in the fight for over 30 minutes, shooting down several aircraft and breaking up multiple attack runs. The bomber crews would later nominate him for the Medal of Honor. He became a legend overnight. But what struck the crews most was not his marksmanship. It was that he stayed. He did not run. He held the line. That was the new message in the skies over Berlin. The Americans were not turning back. Back on the Eid ground, Luftwaffe command struggled to process the magnitude of the event. Their losses were unsustainable. Veteran pilots were gone. Replacement aircraft were in short supply. Fuel reserves were low. And for the first time, the question echoed down every corridor of command. What if this was the new normal? The idea that Berlin itself could be bombed in broad daylight under continuous fighter escort was not just a military threat. It was a cultural rupture. Civilians heard the engines, saw the silver specks in the sky, watched bombs fall on their capital under the steady hum of American air power. In basements and air raid shelters, whispers grew louder. If the Americans could reach Berlin like this today, what could they do tomorrow? By the end of the mission, the 8th Air Force had dropped thousands of pounds of explosives on military and industrial targets throughout the city. The cost was not light. Bombers were lost. Lives were sacrificed. But compared to previous raids, the numbers were astonishingly low. The Mustangs had changed everything. It wasn't just a tactical shift. It was a demonstration of arrival, a declaration that no part of Germany was beyond reach, that no airspace belonged exclusively to the Reich anymore. The Luftwaffe had not just been intercepted. It had been outmaneuvered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. And this was only the beginning. If moments like these make history come alive for you, if the roar of engines and the silence of shattered assumptions resonate somewhere deep, leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you want to stand with us as we uncover the overlooked battles that shaped the modern world, subscribe today. Every story brings a new revelation, and your support keeps them flying. In the weeks following the first Mustang-escorted raid on Berlin, something began to shift in the Luftwaffe. Not in the aircraft, not in the weapons, but in the minds of the men who flew. At first, it was subtle. A hesitation before takeoff, a longer pause at the mission briefing, an extra glance toward the sky before climbing into the cockpit. But it was real, and it was growing. German pilots had once been the hunters. The sky was theirs. Fast, aggressive, highly trained, they operated with a confidence forged in years of dominance. They had chased Spitfires over the Channel. They had overwhelmed Soviet formations in the east. They had danced around sluggish bombers above the Ruhr Valley. For a time, the Luftwaffe was not just feared, it was admired, even by its enemies. But now, they were being hunted. Pilots returning from missions spoke of an enemy that did not retreat, an escort that did not vanish over the horizon, a presence that was always there, high above or waiting just behind the clouds. The P-51s were not just an escort, they were a shadow, unshakable, predictable in their coverage, but unpredictable in their aggression. There was a psychological weight to it. The Mustang became more than a machine. It became a symbol, a signal that the airspace over Germany was no longer German, that the Reich's air defense was no longer untouchable, that the sky, once a shield, had become a cage. Veteran German pilots, some with over 200 kills, began to fall, not through carelessness, but through exhaustion and surprise. The old tactics did not work anymore. Diving and running, the Mustang followed. Climbing away, the Mustang matched altitude. Turning into a tight spiral, the Mustang held position, methodical, waiting for a mistake. For many Luftwaffe fighters, the only real option was escape, and even that was no longer guaranteed. It was not just the dogfights that hurt morale. It was the anticipation, Every briefing carried a question no one dared ask aloud. Will they be there again today? And the answer was always yes. Even ground crews noticed the difference. Engines came back more damaged. Pilots returned shaken. Some never spoke about what happened up there. Others broke. Discipline, expressing doubt in the mission itself. One young flight officer wrote in a letter home that the Mustang was like a ghost. You do not see it, you feel it first. Then, it is already too late. The Luftwaffe command, desperate to contain the psychological bleed, issued new protocols, more aggressive patrol patterns, revised formations, increased flak support. But the truth was unavoidable. No amount of paper strategy could compensate for the raw reach and presence of the Mustang. And then there was the silence. A different kind of silence. Not the quiet of a ceasefire or peace, but the silence that fell over airfields when squadrons did not return, when radios stopped answering, when names were erased from the blackboard in the ready room. Again and again, the pilots who had once joked about milk-run missions now sat in silence, helmets in hand, eyes fixed on the floor. For the bomber crews, the change was the opposite. Morale rose. Reports showed fewer losses, more successful strikes. A sense of invincibility began to take root, not because they were better trained, but because they were no longer alone. Bomber gunners who once fired blindly at distant fighters now watched Mustangs tear into enemy formations before they even reached striking distance. The defensive mindset was replaced by a sense of momentum. The offensive had finally found its legs. And still, the Mustang stayed, even when fuel ran low, even when flak thickened, even when enemy fighters threw themselves at the bomber stream in suicidal desperation. The Mustang stayed. It turned back only when the bombers were safe, only when the mission was complete. And by then, the damage was done, not just to aircraft, but to belief. That was the true impact of the Mustang, not measured only in kills or sorties or missions completed, but in the erosion of confidence, the collapse of faith. The moment a fighter pilot, once certain of his dominance, began to doubt. Doubt is the beginning of defeat. And once it takes root in the mind of a warrior, no armor can stop what comes next. By April 1944, German intelligence reports described a growing concern among commanders. They used cautious words, fatigue, overextension. But between the lines, the message was clear. The Luftwaffe was bleeding out, and the Mustang was turning the screw. Veteran aces began to avoid unnecessary engagements. Replacement pilots, fresh out of accelerated training programs, barely knew how to navigate combat, let alone survive it. The average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot dropped to just a few missions. Some never made it past their first. And yet, the Mustang pressed deeper. It was no longer just an escort. It was a force of psychological warfare, a reminder with wings. Every time it appeared, it whispered a brutal truth into the minds of those below. There is no safe place. The Luftwaffe had built its strategy around territory, around the illusion that there were lines the enemy could not cross. But the Mustang had no lines, no borders, no hesitation. It entered German airspace with the same confidence it left England, and it stayed until its mission was done. For civilians, too, this had an effect. The once comforting drone of German fighters scrambling to meet incoming bombers was replaced by the roar of American engines overhead. The air raid sirens came earlier, stayed longer. The sky itself seemed to groan under the weight of this new, permanent pressure. The Mustang had become a psychological weapon, and Germany had no answer for it. If this story stirred something in you, if the human side of air warfare speaks louder than the machines themselves, share your thoughts below. And if you find value in remembering the cost and courage behind every turning point in history, consider subscribing. Your support helps keep these memories alive with the respect and gravity they deserve. By the spring of 1944, the skies over Germany no longer obeyed the rules written just a year before. The air war, once a chess match of precision and attrition, had devolved into something far more devastating. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang had done more than challenge Luftwaffe tactics. It had shattered the very structure that held the German air defense together. The Luftwaffe had always been a force of talent over numbers. In the early years of the war, it thrived on quality. Pilots were groomed through a rigorous training pipeline. Aces were forged in the fires of Spain, Poland, France, and Russia, and those veterans became the backbone of Germany's aerial dominance. Men like Galland, Hartmann, Marseille, names that carried weight, precision killers in the sky. But by 1944, they were being hunted. The Allied strategy was no longer just to win the air, it was to dismantle the Luftwaffe itself. Not in theory, not through attrition, but directly, head-on, mission after mission, with no rest, no pause, and no place to retreat. What the Mustang had given the Allies reach, the ability to carry the fight not just into German skies, but into German routines, airfields, training centers, fuel convoys, repair depots. Nothing was safe anymore. No corner of the Luftwaffe's ecosystem was out of range. Pilots who survived one mission returned to find their base strafed. Fuel trucks exploded in columns. Runways cratered by bombing raids launched just hours after takeoff. Replacement aircraft sat in fields, burning before they ever flew. The Mustang was no longer a defensive escort. It had become an offensive scalpel, cutting directly into the arteries of German air power. And then came the loss of experience. The Luftwaffe's veteran pilots were not just skilled, they were essential. Many squadrons operated with one or two seasoned flyers, leading entire formations of green recruits. When those leaders were killed, their replacements were often boys barely out of flight school. Some had fewer than 30 hours of total flight time. They knew how to take off, they knew how to shoot, but they did not know how to survive. And survival, in 1944, was a skill measured in seconds. American fighter doctrine had evolved rapidly. Mustang pilots were trained not just to engage, but to dominate. Boom and zoom tactics exploited the P-51's speed and climb rate. Instead of turning fights, they used altitude and aggression. Dive fast, fire, climb away, repeat. German pilots, trained in older traditions, found themselves constantly on the earth, back foot. Even when they saw the enemy first, they could rarely act fast enough to escape. The average life expectancy of a new Luftwaffe pilot dropped to less than 2 weeks. In some squadrons, pilots refused to fly unless ordered. In others, they went up knowing they had no real chance. Not against the endless wave of American bombers and the Mustangs that surrounded them like sharks in a feeding frenzy. German command tried to adapt. Aircraft production was redirected. The FW-190 was modified for higher altitudes. The Me-262 jet fighter was pushed into service despite technical flaws. Emergency training programs were created to flood the ranks with new pilots, but it was never enough, and every adjustment came too late. Because America was not just winning in the air, it was winning on the ground. Factories in California, Michigan, and Texas were operating around the clock. The United States produced more than 15 P-51s every single day. By June 1944, there were thousands in active service and more arriving weekly. Each one carried not only firepower, but confidence, a belief that this war could be won from the sky. Germany could no longer keep up. Their factories were bombed, their transport lines destroyed. Fuel was running dry. Even the best pilot in the world was helpless in an empty cockpit or behind the stick of a half-fueled fighter. The Reich's strategy, once so meticulous, had crumbled into reaction. Every mission became an emergency. Every sortie, sacrifice. And still, the Mustangs came. They flew in formation. They flew alone. They flew low, strafing rail lines and convoys. They flew high, clearing the sky of interceptors before the bombers arrived. They flew at dawn. They flew at dusk. They flew with a patience that no German pilot could match. Because for every loss, there were 10 more ready to take their place. For every Mustang shot down, another 2 were already en route from the factories. And behind the pilots, there was a system, logistics, infrastructure, precision, a war machine that fed itself with steel and oil and human will. It did not depend on legends. It did not rely on aces. It relied on math, and the math was terrifying. In less than 4 months, the Luftwaffe lost more than 5,000 aircraft. Thousands more were damaged, and the real loss, the one no statistic could capture, was control. Control of the sky, control of the mission, control of the narrative. Once, the Luftwaffe had chosen the terms. Now, they responded. Always late, always outnumbered, always exhausted. It was not a defeat in battle. It was a collapse of momentum. And that momentum now belonged to the United States. The Mustang was not the only plane in the air, but it was the one that tipped the balance. It did not bring thunder, it brought persistence. And that persistence crushed the myth of German invincibility piece by piece. If you made it this far, I invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments. This story, like the Mustang itself, is driven by the power of memory. And if you believe these forgotten moments deserve to be remembered, subscribe and help keep history flying strong. By the final months of the war, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force it once was. The sky, once their domain, had become hostile, unfamiliar, and deadly. Not because of some grand offensive or miracle weapon, but because of something far more persistent, relentless, quietly devastating. A single aircraft arrived with its tanks full, its intentions clear, and never once asked for permission to leave. The P-51 Mustang had done more than escort bombers. It had reversed the psychology of air war itself. It had taken the fear that once belonged to Allied crews and transferred it into the hearts of those who had long ruled the skies. It made the Luftwaffe feel what others had felt for years: helplessness, fatigue, inevitable defeat. By May 1945, Germany's once feared fighter command had been reduced to a scattered collection of airfields, stripped of fuel, short on planes, and filled with silence. Pilots who had once flown hundreds of missions were either dead, captured, or grounded. New recruits were barely trained before being sent to their deaths. Many never saw a Mustang before it struck. Some never even left the runway. The Reich's industrial centers had been gutted, its transport lines shattered. Its sky belonged to someone else. The concept of aerial supremacy was no longer a balance of power. It was American, undeniably, irreversibly American. On one of the last days of the war, a Mustang pilot flying a solo patrol over southern Germany looked down and saw an airfield with dozens of fighters parked in neat rows. Not a single one moved. No scramble, no response, no defense. He circled twice, low and slow, daring someone to rise, but nothing did. The war had already been decided, not with a final blow, but with 1,000 strikes before it, with every bomber that made it home, with every mission flown deeper, with every Mustang that refused to turn back. The fear of that sound, the one that began as a low growl and rose into a roar of 6 machine guns, had become legend. German troops on the ground learned to recognize it. They called it the whistle of death, a streak of silver across a blue sky, often unseen until it was too late. And yet, when the war ended, many of those same soldiers expressed respect, even awe. They understood that the Mustang had not just broken them, it had outlasted them. It was never a tool of revenge. It was a symbol of resolve, of what happens when an idea becomes a machine and that machine becomes unstoppable. And the numbers said it all. 15,000 P-51s produced, nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft shot down, dozens of escort missions without a single bomber lost. It was a masterpiece of engineering. But it became a myth because it arrived at a moment when the world was changing. A moment when industrial power met tactical brilliance and created something that could not be ignored. What began as an experiment, born from a rushed proposal and a borrowed engine, became the final word in the skies over Europe. And when the shooting stopped, it remained. In museums, in stories, in the memories of those who watched it pass overhead. It did not win the war alone, but it changed how wars would be fought forever. Because reach matters, endurance matters, and so does the will to see a mission through to the end. If this story moved you, even a little, I want to thank you for walking with me through the skies of history. Your time and attention matter, and if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, shared, and preserved, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts, share what you felt, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And don't stop here. Click on the next video that just appeared on your screen. There's more waiting to be discovered, more echoes of courage, more forgotten truths, because history never ends. It just waits to be found again.